Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Middleware Friday for April 21st, 2017. What we're going to be talking about today is ingesting high-speed telemetry into an Azure Event Hub and then consuming this data using Azure Logic Apps. We've got a bit of a shorter show today. In part, I've been traveling a lot the last week for both work and for pleasure. Well, if you call pleasure running a marathon. But yeah, I had a tremendous experience in Boston running the Boston Marathon. I've captured a bunch of footage and I will include that in some bonus coverage in the next episode. I just wanted to take some more time in order to edit all of that content. But today we're going to be focusing on Azure Logic Apps and using the Azure Event Hub connector that is currently in preview in order to ingest some high-speed telemetry data. And then what we're going to do is we're going to publish that to a Power BI real-time data set. Along the theme of industrial IoT, we're also going to talk about a recent announcement from the Azure Stream Analytics team where they're talking about ASA running on edge devices. And it does fit in well with this overall episode as we talk about large-scale telemetry ingestion. So if you had a chance to attend Integrate or to watch my presentation from Integrate, I've got the link below here. I introduced a project that we were working on at my employer around industrial IoT and one of our fuel types and consuming all of the telemetry information coming out of that SCADA system via Historian into our environment, where we would then feed an on-premise Historian, and that's why we've got a service bus topic here as a specific route, but also the ability to publish these events to Power BI. So I thought it'd be interesting, now that we've got an Event Hub's connector in preview for Logic Apps, to see what this solution would look like in Logic Apps. So what we've essentially done here is we've replaced the Azure Stream Analytics process job with Azure Logic Apps, and we're going to then take advantage of the Power BI connector in order to publish this telemetry directly to a dashboard. So to get started, we can create a new Logic app, search for Event Hub, and we'll actually see that the Event Hubs are now in preview. The Event Hub connector is now in preview for Azure Logic Apps. Now this is something that's pretty cool. It was highlighted in, I believe it was the last Logic Apps Live episode, where the Azure Logic Apps team is now making it very simple to connect to other Azure services, which in this case would be an Event Hub. So it's detected that I have an Event Hub namespace in my same subscription that my Logic app is running in called Middleware Friday EH. What I can now do is I can now click on this particular namespace, and I no longer have to go hunting for the connection string for my specific endpoint. So this makes the process much more seamless and provides a great user experience. So thanks, Logic Apps team. Next, and this is also very cool, it's going to surface all of the different shared access policies that are available within this namespace. And in this case, we've got 3. We've got root, which is the default access policy that's provisioned alongside your Event Hub. Then I've gone ahead and created 2. One is for my subscriber, my Logic App subscriber. The other is going to be for my sender, which is really my test harness. Now it is important to note that you do need additional permissions if you want this experience to be more seamless. So typically you always want to have the least amount of privileges required, which as a subscriber should really be listen. You want to be able to listen on the Event Hub for new events. The problem is if I use listen, I can't kind of auto-interrogate to see what Event Hubs are part of my namespace that we've configured. What'll end up happening is when I go ahead to click on the drop down for the Event Hub name, it'll raise an error indicating I don't have the right level of access, and which is true, I don't. I'm really only trying to subscribe, I'm not trying to manage that endpoint. But if we go ahead and include the manage claim, which will then also include send by default, now we'll have the ability to click on the Event Hub name and see that, I've got an Event Hub called Meter Reads, and this is exactly the one I want to go ahead and use. So pretty cool. It does require a little bit more permissions because what it is actually using the management API underneath the hood, and in order to use that management API you need that elevated access. Here's an example of a message that I'm going to be sending from my test harness. Now initially I started off sending one of these messages, so it's a batch of 10 different tag reads, and you can think of a tag very much as a device. And what I'm doing is sending 10 of these every second. I did run into some issues with this, so I did turn that down, and I'm sending a batch of 10 in every 20 seconds now, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But I can use this sample message and use the parse JSON action that's provided by Logic Apps. And by going ahead and selecting this action, I can now provide a sample message body, which I just showed you on the previous screen, and now I'm going to have a schema that is available for me, which allows me to use type data in my downstream connectors. So what happens here, we've got an event coming into an Event Hub. I'm able to parse that JSON based upon that schema, and then what Logic Apps has done is it's actually detected that this is a batch of records, and it's going to add a for each. And then what I'm able to do is iterate on this node called read values, and then I can use, basically pluck off each of these individual attributes and publish it to Power BI, which is pretty cool. That was part of the demo that I had done last year in Integrate, but now I'm able to use some of these connectors as opposed to doing some of this work in Azure Stream Analytics. So let's jump into a quick demo. First thing I did want to show though is on a previous episode we talked about the Service Bus 360 tool provided by BizTalk 360, and one of the capabilities that I did mention as part of that tool was the ability to send in sample events from the Service Bus 360 console. So in this case, I've got a namespace for Middleware Friday EH as we described. It is, when I've configured it in Service Bus 360, I've said that this is an Event Hub namespace, and now I can go ahead and manage it. And within the management experience, I have the ability to send events. So I'm going to take the sample message that I showed in the presentation before. I can select which partition. Now this particular Event Hub has 4 partitions. It doesn't really matter which one I want to send it to. And what we'll see is an activity in progress related to it, and now one that actually has been completed successfully. And we'll see that that event actually hits the Event Hub and then gets added to our dashboard. So that's great as a very simple sort of test tool for doing a single event. But when we have a Power BI dashboard, we want to be able to display several events at a time. So what I've built is a very simple simulator based upon C# and just a Windows form. And as I described before, I'm going to go ahead and publish a new event every 20 seconds, and each event is going to contain a batch of 20 records. Now if we flip over to Power BI, I've created a very simple dashboard, and we could spend another whole Middleware Friday on using Power BI and constructing dashboards, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what is possible, based upon my demo from Integrate last year. And all we have here is we've got our 10 different tags, and we really just have a time series of the different events that are coming in. I can go ahead and select and zero in on specific events if I want. I could also go ahead and set different KPI thresholds if there were specific values, low values or high values that I wanted to make sure that I'm within that range. So this is a pretty neat and very quick way of going ahead and provisioning a dashboard solution that's consuming data from an Azure Event Hub. And if you do want more information around how to configure the Power BI real-time data sets, I encourage you to go back to episode 6. You can find it at this URL here, where I walk you through that experience. I just didn't want to go ahead and do that again in this particular episode and have a bunch of redundant information. Now, one thing that I did allude to earlier was this idea of publishing too many events too quickly. And what I found when I was publishing that batch of 10 records every second was that I started to run into throttling issues with the Power BI connector. So as you can see below here, we've got a status 429, rate limit is exceeded, try again in 40 seconds. So what I had to do is I had to tune this down, reduce the rate in which I was publishing events to every 20 seconds, and then I was able to find a more kind of seamless experience around this. Now, I do know that the connectors team is tweaking some of these values, partly based upon just kind of consumption patterns across the customer base. But this is where I would perceive to be some challenges with some industrial use cases. So what I've gone ahead is to create a very quick little chart here that describes when to use each technology. Because this was certainly something I never ran into before when I was using Azure Stream Analytics to publish to Power BI. And I think the reality is when you talk about industrial IoT, you're really talking about a vast amount of data very quickly. And one of the strengths of Azure Stream Analytics is its ability to aggregate data. Because you may have devices that are publishing telemetry every second or even more frequently than that. Being in the power business, we do have some devices that are emitting telemetry several times a second. Now, naturally, if you're publishing data that quickly, it's very difficult to manage. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to be storing all of this data. And that's where Stream Analytics plays an important role, where it has the ability to aggregate this data based upon its windowing technology. So for example, you may be getting telemetry data every second, but it only makes sense to get a rolled up or an averaged value for every minute. And what that allows you to do is store one record of data as opposed to storing 60 records of data. And that would be a scenario where you do want to take advantage of Stream Analytics. Another area is around calculations. So Stream Analytics has recently introduced a feature around JavaScript that allows you to write some functions, reusable functions in JavaScript that you can also tie to your windowing if you need to perform things like engineering calculations around your real-time data stream. The other thing that ASA allows you to do is to join streams. So streams can be real-time in nature, or they can be static data where you want to actually go ahead and enrich this data. So these are all scenarios where I would use Azure Stream Analytics as opposed to Logic Apps for consuming data out of an Event Hub. However, there's still a lot of applicable use cases for Logic Apps and how Logic Apps can be consuming information from an Event Hub. And certainly when you need to provide additional connectivity to other systems, you really want to take advantage of Logic Apps, and maybe that's tying into, say, some sort of work order management system. Perhaps it's ServiceNow, perhaps it's SAP, and you can actually use Logic Apps as an off-ramp from an Event Hub in order to connect into some of these other different scenarios. I do think that while Azure Logic Apps can scale, it's an integration platform as a service, it's serverless by nature, and Azure can scale infinitely. I think you are going to be constrained by some of the rate limiting around the connectors which we saw today. So that's something you want to validate as you're going through your different use cases is to ensure you're not going to hit any of those upper limits. And if you do hit some of those upper limits, I encourage you to reach out to the product group. They may be able to help you. They've been a great resource for us as we've run into some of these upper limits with some of the other connectors. Another scenario which I don't think gets talked about a whole lot, but it is completely valid. It's this idea of chaining different event hubs together. So you may have a scenario where you have an initial event hub ingesting a lot of telemetry data. You're doing some level of aggregation, some level of calculations, but ultimately that data has to go somewhere else. And one place where that could go is to another event hub. And from there, you may want to connect an Azure Logic app in order to publish that information to a system, which it could be Power BI or it could be SAP. So you can think of a lot of processes that exist in power plants where they're running SAP. You may need to create some sort of a maintenance record. If you find that a piece of equipment is performing poorly, you want to actually go ahead and log that in that system of record. And once again, you may want to do some level of aggregation up front. You may want to use the windowing features of Azure Stream Analytics, but then you also want to take advantage of the connectivity that's provided in Logic Apps. And you can certainly do this by chaining event hubs together via ASA and Azure Logic Apps. It really speaks to the breadth and the better together story that exists around all of the different Azure services. Also, I think it's important to evaluate your costs. Azure Logic Apps has a consumption model, which is great, but when you do think about industrial IoT, you may have millions and millions of events. I think for us, we've done recent inventory and we have well greater 100,000 different devices that emit telemetry. Now, in that case, even with a graduated pricing tier, you may not want to go down the Logic Apps route. You definitely owe it to yourself to get into the calculators and actually predict or forecast your actual consumption and choose the best tool based upon your consumption patterns. Next up, let's talk about community content. And this does come from the Azure Stream Analytics team. And since we are talking about ASA as part of this particular episode, I figured it was worthwhile talking about as part of the community content. And what's interesting here is now we have the ability to run ASA queries on edge devices. It very much is in line with a lot of the volume that we've just been talking about, where you may have some scenarios where you don't want to publish all of this information up to the cloud in order to do some level of aggregation. So you can think of scenarios where you might have occasional connectivity, but you still need the underlying equipment to run, with or without the presence of an internet connection. So some of the examples that they've called out here included an offshore wind farm, offshore drilling, shipping and transportation, in addition to, say, an airplane manufacturer or an airplane company, where you've got an airplane in flight generating terabytes of information, and you don't have the network connectivity to publish this data in real time. So how this really works is the Azure Stream Analytics on edge devices is going to plug into the Azure IoT Gateway SDK. And what is interesting about the Azure IoT Gateway SDK is it's very modular. So I previously wrote an article for InfoQ about this, where you have the ability to call an Azure function from a module that exists within the field gateway. Well, now, being it modular itself, we can now include the Azure Stream Analytics piece and actually now perform analytics on the edge device, as opposed to having to publish all of that information up to the cloud. And certainly you can still publish all of that information to the cloud, but what you are doing is some level of aggregation locally in order to reduce your dependency on network connectivity and also your bandwidth. If you are talking about occasionally connected scenarios, there's a high probability that you are using some sort of expensive network connectivity, whether that be satellite or cellular data, in order to send this information up, and you want to be as efficient as possible with that different data feed. So definitely an article worth checking out. There's a bunch of other Azure IoT information coming out at Hannover Messe, which is really the place to be if you are involved in the industrial internet and the industrial Internet of Things. Feedback, always welcome. And thanks again for watching this edition of Middleware Friday, and we'll catch you next week.
I've been looking forward to my life changing. Circle getting smaller, I don't like strangers. That has had me on meds as a teenager. Homies morphing on me like the Green Ranger. I was running from something, young and I was coming from nothing. In the last year alone, I got 100 new cousins. I've been hanging with the vultures and swimming with the sharks just to get to the light. I had to go through the dark, yeah. I took my vices and I turned them into strengths. Took my talent and I channeled all my angst. Took for granted all the beauty and the pain, so that's why I take your hatred and return it with a thanks. There ain't shit that you can say to me. I've been living crazily. I ain't slowing down if you listen and pray for me. Wouldn't change a thing, not the struggles or the pain. Cause everything I went through, that's what made me me.
I don't wanna fake anything while living this life. I'm forcing myself to see the brightest light on the other side.
Everybody go through pain, you gotta keep fighting. Wrestle in the pen every time that I'm writing. Every dollar in my pocket was earned by being righteous. If you never been through a struggle, then we have no likeness. I don't ever hype shit, tell it how it is, miss. Lost family